All right, History 7. Welcome. It's Mr. Kirk here, although I'm not here teaching in front of you right now, hopefully hearing my voice and looking through the notes over the course of the next 20 or so minutes will give you a good indication as far as what we'll be covering here in Chapter 11. So, as I give you guys a lecture on Chapter 11, what I'm going to ask you guys to do is make sure that you get down these slides as far as your notes are concerned. So it's a little bit ironic to think about talking about this wave of technology here in Chapter 11, especially talking about northern industry, that here we are in my first technologically advanced lesson here using the Explain Everything app. So hopefully this is working for you at home on your computers here. So chapter 11, as we already know, is talking about the North and the South taking different paths. And over the course of Monday and Wednesdays, we talked about the birth of the Industrial Revolution. And certainly the word industry there, talking about manufacturing, as well as that word revolution, something that we've seen at great lengths this year. Revolution meaning change. Okay, we've looked at the American Revolution, we've looked at the Haitian Revolution, the French Revolution. Now, here, when talking about the Industrial Revolution, we're talking about, in reality, a change in technology. Okay, so taking a look here, the Industrial Revolution, on many accounts, is known as a revolution in technology. When you think about it, machines do take the place of hand tools. That's really a textbook definition here. So as I pull out my red pen here, taking a look, machines taking the place of hand tools, things were done by hand throughout the course of the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries, okay, especially talking about colonial life and life in North America. Everything was done by hand, but with new technology, new inventions, we're beginning to see easier ways and more efficient ways of making different goods. Okay, now keep in mind the Industrial Revolution begins in Great Britain. Okay, it does not begin in the United States, it begins in Great Britain throughout the 1700s. And for Great Britain's concerns, many of these factories produced textiles, which were distributed not only throughout Europe, but also to the American colonies. Remember, the Industrial Revolution begins prior to the United States even gaining their independence. And the whole reason as to why this Industrial Revolution really gets started is because of a number of key inventors. Almost all historians will say that it's Richard Arkwright that is going to get this whole ball rolling here. Okay, he's a British inventor who invents what is known as the water frame. Okay, we watched that video on Monday. Essentially, the water frame was a way of taking cotton. Now remember, textiles are cloth, things made of cotton. The water frame would take the cotton and tighten it, okay, pull it into very tight strands of thread and string and eventually make yarn. And then from there, seamstresses would be able to make clothing. Okay, so Richard Arkwright's developing this in 1760. Now this is revolutionary for the time. So Great Britain and the government, Parliament, King George III recognized the advantage that Arkwright had brought to the British Empire. Okay, they have a head start on this whole production and manufacturing ideas here. So they want to try to keep everything secret. They don't want France, they don't want Spain and other European countries to recognize the importance of the factory and the importance of the water frame. So what Parliament's going to do is they're going to pass laws that forbade anybody from leaving the country with knowledge of these machines. As I had mentioned to you guys on Monday, they're not necessarily worried about the guy that takes the spool of thread off of the machine and replaces it with a new one. They're more concerned with the scientists, the inventors, the people that worked hand in hand with the creation of these machines. They wanted them to stay put in the country of Great Britain because they didn't want them selling their ideas to France or anywhere else. So here we have Great Britain making and passing laws that want to try and prohibit anybody with knowledge of these water frames or machines getting outside the country. Obviously, the British have something here. And one of the first people to recognize that is a man by the name of Samuel Slater. Now remember, as we had said, Slater is an apprentice to Arkwright, so he's someone that works very closely with him. And as a teenager himself at the time, he recognizes that if he were to take it off and leave Great Britain, he'd be able to make a tremendous amount of money. So he decides on setting his sights on North America, New York, in 1789. So this is after the American Revolution. This is after the United States has gained their independence. Slater feels as though the best way for him to make money would be to take the plans of the water frame and bring them to the United States. The one problem is that the laws forbid him from leaving. So what he has to do is essentially memorize the machine plans. Okay? He can't walk out of the country with these blueprints to these machines. So essentially what he does is he spends weeks upon weeks memorizing the water frame here. Now, once here in the United States, while he has the ideas in his head, he has memorized them, he needs someone to financially back him. He needs an investor, okay, someone who's willing to invest their money on something that they think may turn them a profit. And the person that thinks that Slater may be onto something is a man by the name of Moses Brown. Okay, now Moses Brown is actually a Quaker. He's a wealthy businessman and investor here, and he believes that the two of them, Brown and Slater together, have the opportunity to make a huge statement here in the United States from a technological standpoint. So what they decide to do is they'll get their money together, not only to build these water frames, but also to build a factory. And this would be this would be the first American factory in the United States, located on the Pawtucket River in Rhode Island, that is constructed in 1791. Pawtucket, along with New England, will become the industrial capital for the United States as we enter into the 19th century. Okay. We mentioned that Slater was nicknamed the father of the American factory system because of his contributions to this. So, as far as the Industrial Revolution is concerned, yes, Arkwright is important to the British Industrial Revolution, but Slater, for bringing his ideas here to the United States, is single-handedly the most important person to the Industrial Revolution here in the United States. So keep in mind, first factory in Pawtucket, Rhode Island. Okay, and keep in mind that it is because of Moses Brown that he's able to finance the construction of not only water frames, multiple ones, but also to build a factory there in Pawtucket. Obviously, as we can see through the invention of Arkwright in the 1760s, and with Samuel Slater then bringing the ideas of the water frame to the United States and constructing the first factory there in 1791, there's certainly going to be a number of positive effects of the Industrial Revolution when it comes to the United States. The problem is that there's also some negative effects. So let's take a look at the positive effects first. Okay, one of the things that we're going to see come out of this time period is what is called the factory system. Now, what the factory system is going to do is allow machines and workers to really work together, especially to make more efficient work. And I think we'll be able to see that as we look through section 2 and 3 and these other inventions, is that with the new technology comes more efficient work. More work is able to be done in a shorter period of time. And one other thing is this idea of the factories really bringing people to a common workplace. When you think about colonial society, so many people were working on their individual farms. They weren't necessarily interacting with people within, a large community. So what the factory system is making reference to is first and foremost, like your textbook says, using machines and workers coming and working together, but obviously also this idea of there being a more communal place for work. Now, what this word efficient means, okay, is certainly easier work, okay, and because it's easier and because it becomes cheaper, one of the other positive effects of the Industrial Revolution is going to be this idea of producing things as far as mass production is concerned, okay. For the factory owners, the more products that they could produce, the more money they could make. So if things are being done efficiently, and there's less money being put into the factories to make these textiles, obviously many people, especially these investors and capitalists that we made mention of on Monday and Wednesday, are going to be making a lot of money. So certainly we can cue that up to being a positive effect. Another positive effect, and we'll talk more about these effects throughout the chapter, are certainly the invention of interchangeable parts. Um, in a lot of capacities, sometimes this particular invention or thought process is a little bit undermined. But Eli Whitney, who is going to be probably the most important of the inventors that we will take a look at in this chapter. Now, for Eli Whitney, he recognizes that things that were handcrafted, made by individuals, were made with very specific parts. So let's take, for instance, people who made guns. Every gun was individually special. They were made with its own parts. What Eli Whitney recognizes is that if a gun were to break, like takes for example during the American Revolution, it would be very difficult to fix that gun if the trigger were to snap off because the maker of that gun made a very specific trigger for that gun. What Eli Whitney wants to do is create interchangeable parts for manufactured goods. So, for instance, as we move into the 19th century, for Eli Whitney, making a universal trigger for guns so that if a trigger were to break, it could be easily replaced. So, what we want to see with interchangeable parts is that it makes machine parts compatible for all manufactured goods. So, if there is a mechanism for, say, a rifle or whatever, there would be those parts there that would be interchangeable. So these would be, okay, the one, the second, and the third important effect of the Industrial Revolution. As far as the negative effects go, unfortunately, there are certain negative effects, and the first of which is probably the biggest one is the idea of child labor. What many factory owners want to do is make more money. It's all about the money. Mr. Kirk's rule of history. Regardless if it's a government or country, and even for these rich people, okay, they want to make as much money and they want to have as small of costs as possible. So what we see during the Industrial Revolution is factory owners hiring children. Now, there's a few problems with hiring children. One, um, they are being hired and employed at the age of 7. Why is that bad? Well, as you can imagine, if you are working 6 days a week, you're not going to be in school. So, what we are seeing in some of these major cities is that children are unable to attain an education and instead are spending their days, long days, in these factories. Now, the reason as to why factory owners wanted to hire them was because children would be a cheap form of labor. Okay, think about it. At 7 years old, what did you have to pay for? Nothing. At the age of 12 and 13, what do you even have to pay for now? So, certainly for factory owners back in the 19th century, children would be a cheap form of labor. They could also fit into small places and small areas. Okay, think about sometimes when you have to go and get a coin that's stuck between your car seat. Sometimes it's easier for you guys to go and get them because you have smaller hands. Well, that was kind of the mindset behind hiring children to get into small places to help to be able to fix machines as well. Now, on the flip side of things, again, some families who are middle of lower class would be willing to send their children to the factories so that they could make money. So, while their factory owners were a little bit greedy, at the same time, some families, unfortunately, were willing to send their children to try and accumulate as much money for the family during this time period. Another negative effect of the Industrial Revolution is going to be the poor working conditions. Obviously, with factories, they were new at the time, they weren't well maintained. A lot of people who were working these new inventions and new machines weren't necessarily, as I would say, capable of doing that. So there were a lot of injuries. There was no workers' comp back then, so there was no insurance. So if you got hurt on the job, if you couldn't perform, you would lose your job, okay? And unfortunately, they would find someone else to work for you. These factories were very dark, musty, and dangerous. It would have led to widespread diseases for many of these people who were working in these factories. So certainly, the poor factory conditions is yet another negative effect of the Industrial Revolution. Last but not least, another major negative effect of the revolution itself is that there were long, long, long hours. Okay, on average, those who worked in factories would work anywhere between 12 and 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. On Sunday, they would rest and have a family day there. So, with long work hours, obviously that's going to put a strain on the family, but also these long hours in poor factory conditions, and especially when talking about children working these long hours, 6 days a week for at least half the day is going to put a strain on anybody. So there are certainly more positive and negative effects of the Industrial Revolution, and hopefully we will be getting to those over the course of the rest of the section. So here we are with Section 2, the North transformed. And as we had said earlier in the week, the North and the South are going to take on very different paths. The North is going to rely heavily on factories as far as making their money. The South, on the other hand, as we will see when we get to Section 3 notes, is going to rely heavily still on agriculture. New inventions will spur the growth of slavery, and those are all things that we'll get to talking about tomorrow. Okay, so as we see here with the beginning of Section 2, one of the big things that we're going to see with the growth of factories in the North is something known as urbanization, which is one of your key terms here. Um, Urbanization talks about the growth of cities and people wanting to leave their farms in rural areas and move to these areas where the factories are. And that's where some of the earliest cities are going to be. And the reason as to why they're doing it is because there are jobs available. In the north, obviously, as we talked about, based off of climate, farming was something that was a little bit more difficult than it would be in the south. People in the north are attracted now to these cities. So that's going to lead to certainly an increased population in many of these northern cities, cities like Boston, New York City, which is revolutionized here in the beginning of the 1800s based off of factories. Cities like Pittsburgh and even Louisville, all the way out in Kentucky, are going to see spiked populations during this time period. One of the things that we're going to see also in this section is not only are there Americans moving to these northern cities, but also immigrants as well. The idea of opportunity to come here to the new world, come here as an opportunity, the land of opportunity, will spike interest for many immigrants from European countries. However, because of this heavily spiked populations here in these northern cities, one of the big things is that there are some early problems, unfortunately, which your textbook highlights some of them. One of the obvious big things are filthy streets, housing becomes a major issue. There's no proper sewage systems very early on in these northern cities. Drinking water becomes infected, which leads to widespread disease. But also because these cities are heavily populated, you have factories there, and many of the homes were not built according to what we would call standards of today. There were widespread fires. And an interesting note, during this time in many of these major cities, uh, the fire departments back then would make their money based off of insurances. So when a fire were to break out in say New York City, there would be multiple fire departments going to one fire to compete to put out the fire so that they could make money. So many of these northern cities very early on have a number of major issues that pertain to them. One of the great things about American history is, as we're going to look at um, the number of advancements made in factories and industry and manufacturing, but there are also other cultural advancements, technological advancements that are going to revolutionize the way Americans live. And probably one of the more famous ones is known as the telegraph. Okay, and there's a picture down here on the bottom of what a telegraph would look like, and it was invented by this man here, Samuel F.B. Morse. Okay, Morse called his telegraph the talking wire. Okay, and what he wanted to do was run having two telegraphs on either side. Okay, that would be connected by copper wire. And basically, what you would do is you would tap a series of dots and dashes. Okay, and this would basically form an alphabet. Um, A would be a certain amount of dots and dashes. The letter B would be a certain amount of dots and dashes. There would be a long pause between words. So, as far as communicating over long distances, this is going to change a lot. Okay, back remember in the 19th century, there's no cell phones, there's no iPads. We talked about earlier back in the first trimester about think about the War of 1812, the Treaty of Ghent signed in 1814. It's not until 1815 that word gets back to the United States that the war is officially over, and meanwhile, the Battle of New Orleans had already taken place, and thousands of people killed. So the telegraph is going to be a huge communication advancement here. Um, what hath God wrought makes reference to the first phrase that is sent between Washington, D.C. And Baltimore. So it was close to 40 miles, the first successful telegraph that was ran. and it's going to revolutionize the way that Americans communicate with each other, not only during the 19th century, but obviously is going to lead to the creation of the telephone much later on. I think everyone recognizes the telegraph as really one of those landmark achievements when it comes to um, inventions in the 19th century. But while that's referring to communication, obviously there are a number of inventions that are going to be made that will revolutionize agriculture. And the first of those is going to be the mechanical reaper that is seen here up on the right. The mechanical reaper is essentially um, it's basically a modern day lawnmower. You would still need to use animals, as pictured here, horses, to pull a huge machine. And this is going to be able to cut wheat at a tremendously fast, quicker pace than if it were done by hand. Okay, done by hand, this is when we're talking about the Industrial Revolution, machines taking the place of hand tools. If you were to cut wheat stalks by hand, you would have to use a very sharp blade, saws or machetes, etc. Um, with the mechanical reaper here that is attached to a wheel, you would basically plow over the wheat, and it's cutting this wheat at a much greater rate. Um, Now, when we're talking about this agricultural advancement here in the mechanical reaper, um, it's it's really affecting the West. The West was where wheat was being grown. You don't see a lot of wheat being grown typically in the South because of the warm, humid climate. When we're talking about the South, we're talking about tobacco, yes, but obviously also cotton that we'll get to in section 3. But when we're talking about the West, the area, Kentucky and Tennessee, those would be areas that would use the mechanical reaper to cut wheat. That's where wheat's typically being grown. It's important to note, and I think this last bullet here is extremely important. This invention of the mechanical reaper was just as important to Western farmers as it was to the cotton gin in the South. Okay, the cotton gin is going to revolutionize the way cotton is picked, and it's going to change really the history of the South. The mechanical reaper a lot of times doesn't get as much credit, but nonetheless is simply just as important. We're talking about manufacturing advancements. Obviously, the first one that comes to mind is Richard Arkwright's water frame, that is going to change the way that we take cotton and spool it into yarn. But certainly, the sewing machine here was an invention that really starts to become popular in Europe, particularly England in the 1790s. However, there was never really a proper way that it was ever perfected. There are a lot of glitches in it. Well, Elias Howe and Isaac Singer here in the United States in the 1840s and 50s are going to be credited with perfecting the sewing machine. I remember my grandma, who used to stitch things together for me, had a Singer sewing machine. You could see pictured here. I'm sure many of maybe some of your great grandmas or relatives would have Singer sewing machines. Basically, what the sewing machine does is it makes stitches for you instead of doing it by hand. This is going to change the way clothes are manufactured. It's going to be done much quicker, obviously, much faster, much more efficient. But more importantly, many of these sewing machines not only will be in everyone's home, but also will be brought into the factories. Okay, and this is when we start to talk about textile mills, textile factories, the creation of cloth here in the United States. They're going to be done in the factories. We are going to begin to see women brought into the factories just simply based off of the way that they were used to making clothes. Unfortunately, we'll talk more about this in chapter 12. Many of these seamstresses, women, were not getting fair wages. They were paid very little, and we'll talk more about the women's rights movement as a whole when we get to chapter 12, as far as beginning to discuss about equal pay in the workplace. Now, while the previous inventions are certainly important to the 19th century, I think when we think about this technological revolution, this change in technology, I think the most exciting for the time has to be transportation. If you think about it, ways people got around prior to the 19th century were on horseback, horse and buggy, by boat, sailboat. As we enter into the 19th century, as we begin to recognize that we can create power from water, that are powering the water frame, we could also use steam, okay, as a source of energy here. And in 1807, Robert Fulton, okay, an American inventor, okay, is going to be credited with building the first American steamboat. Now, pictured here to the right in the first picture is what would look like a steamboat very early on there in the 19th century. And that's actually a painting that depicts Fulton's first steamboat that he called the Clermont. Now, many of these early steamboats were used for transportation along rivers, okay, not typically oceans. When talking about the Clermont, though, we're talking about transportation, the first steamboat that would have went from New York City to Albany along the Hudson River. So this was something that was extremely exciting. It was revolutionary for the time period. And Robert Fulton, along with a man by the name of Robert Livingston, would help to further make advancements with the steamboat. Um, Clippers that your textbook mentions are much smaller ships, but they weren't as common back then. But it's important to understand Fulton's associated with the steamboat. Now, when we talk about steamboats or transportation on water, we are somewhat limited. Okay, here in the United States, we have many rivers, but nonetheless, transportation across mountain ranges or across land was always done by horses. I think probably one of the most exciting and certainly most popular inventions during this time are going to be the development of the railroads. All right. Now, railroads are much more convenient because this is probably the easiest answer that you'll have this year. They go over land, okay, and steamboats are resorted to only transportation on water. Now, one of the first American railroads that was built was between Baltimore and Ohio. As we enter into the Great Lake region, the Ohio River Valley, and pictured here below was one of the earliest steam locomotives. All right, as you could see here, water would be put into this machine, and that's going to power and pull train cars along a track. Okay, and the first person to do this is considered to be Peter Cooper. All right, who makes the first successful steam locomotive, and he is going to be able to uh, have a machine that pulls these these train cars along tracks. Now, not only is this used for, very early on, not necessarily transportation for people, eventually it will. As we're going to get to chapter 13, the expansion of the West, the railroad is essential to manifest destiny. But when you think about it, what the railroad is going to do is make it a lot easier for factory owners to send their products out further distances. These factories that are in major cities, New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, now with the building of the railroads throughout the 19th century, um, can send their products throughout the United States, okay? And it's certainly a much more efficient rate. When you get to eighth grade, you'll talk about something known as the Transcontinental Railroad that will be completed in the 1860s. And what the Transcontinental Railroad is exactly what it sounds like, a railroad that goes across the continent. So essentially, California will be, to some capacity, be able to be sent a train car and reach the East Coast over the course of a few days and or weeks. So I think the transportation revolution during this time is certainly very exciting. Now, we've certainly seen the importance of these new inventions to different parts of society in the areas of communication, in the areas of agriculture, in the areas of manufacturing, and certainly the areas of transportation. But one of the big effects of the Industrial Revolution, and we had talked about some of the positive effects earlier at the end of section one there, is that there is certainly going to be a new wave of immigrants who are coming here to the United States during the course of the 19th century. Now, there are a lot of things going on in Europe in the 1800s. Remember, one of the biggest qualities as to why people wanted to come here to North America during the 1700s was the idea of attaining land. Well, now that the United States is expanding westward, that opportunity is still there, okay? But now a new thing is taking place, okay? With factories comes jobs. So there's a lot of Europeans that are coming here during the 19th centuries based off of the idea that they will have the opportunity to buy not only cheap land but also find jobs. So we're going to see huge waves, immigration waves in the 1830s, 1840s and 1850s. Now, for our standards, we're going to take a look really at the first European wave of immigration that takes place during the 19th century, which would be in the 1840s and 50s. When you get to 8th grade, you'll take a look at really that second wave of immigration, which actually takes place not only on the east coast of the United States, but also on the west coast, as immigrants from Asia will begin to flood the west coast of the United States in California and other parts of the United States. Another major reason as to why immigrants will come here during the time period that I had just forementioned is this idea that they needed to be able to survive. And probably the biggest country that many of you would be familiar with as to why many people would be leaving during the 1840s and 50s is going to be what is known as the Great Famine, the Great Hunger, or the Irish Famine. Now, during the 1840s, England controlled all of Ireland. Okay, today Ireland is an independent country except for the Northern Ireland, which is controlled. There's about 7 counties in Ireland that are still under the British Crown there. But nonetheless, during the 1840s, it was a time where England controlled Ireland, and a huge famine is going to take place there because their biggest not only their biggest way of making money and selling this crop, but also their lifestyle as far as what they ate was the potato crop. Okay, and as we highlight that right there. Now, between the 1840s, late 1840s, and 1850s, over 1 million people in Ireland will die of starvation due to this fungus that destroys the potato crop. Okay, now if you were to do the math there, that's about 1/3 of the population that relied on the potato, and without having to eat that, that's going to have significant ramifications. Now, also during this time, we're going to have revolutions in Germany. Okay, revolutions based off of the French Revolution, based off of the American Revolution, and many German immigrants will come here to the United States as well. It's during the time of the 1840s and 1850s that some of your ancestors would have made their way here to the Americas, and for the most part, many of them will settle in some of these big cities like New York City, like Boston. You think about all the Irish ancestry that you would have in those cities, but many of them will also head into what would be considered during colonial times as being the back country, because that's where many Europeans would have settled during the latter part of the 1700s. Now, with more and more people coming to the United States with this idea of finding jobs, that does create competition in the workplace. And many Americans began to worry about foreigners coming here, and they were called nativists. They felt that the United States was for people who were living here at the time, and that those people should have the opportunity to buy land and have the opportunity to uh, have jobs, okay, before immigrants. Now, when you think about it, all right, a rather interesting case there on the part of the nativists because the United States originally was formed by colonists. So the fact that they're sitting here saying that this jobs and land is only for Americans is somewhat hypocritical. And unfortunately, or fortunately rather, this never really takes ground here in the United States. The last part of Section 2 focuses in on African Americans in the North. Now, we're going to talk about the way African Americans were treated in the South, which was certainly unfair. But during the time of the 19th century in the North, many African Americans, free African Americans, were facing discrimination. Many northern states by the mid 1800s already would have taken steps to ban slavery, but that does not mean, Okay, that's one thing I want you guys to remember. This does not mean that they believe that African Americans were equal to whites. They faced many obstacles during the 19th century or during the time period covering now 1830s, 1840s. They do not have the right to vote. Okay, they have huge difficulties in getting jobs. Okay, even in the factories, a form of cheap labor, it was easier for children and even women to get jobs than it would be for African Americans. And what we're going to begin to see in the beginning here of the United States is segregation. Okay, the idea of being separated from society, having separate schools and other public places, places to eat, places to shop, etc. So, for African Americans in the North, although there aren't many slaves at all, unfortunately, there was certainly discrimination that they would have been facing during this time period. Here's just an interesting graph here as far as taking a look at immigration waves of the Western European countries between the years of 1840 and 1860. Notice that during the time between 1840 to 1852, it is Ireland. Okay, 47% of immigrants came from Ireland between 1840 and 1845. 39% immigrants 1845 to 1850. We see a spike again here, 44% and 43, a short time period there. Okay, in 1854, I had made mention on the last slide of the German Revolution, so we're seeing a spiked increase there. So just a rather interesting a chart to see as far as the historical statistics when it comes to the United States censuses that were taken back during this time period. If I were to be in class, finishing up with section 2, a do now that I would just like to make mention of you, and you guys can think about this over the weekend so that when I get back into class on Monday, we can certainly talk about it. But thinking about all the inventions that we had discussed in section 2, and even going back to Arkwright's water frame in section 1, what do you think was the most important innovation, important invention that we covered during the 19th century here? And if I were to ask you that question on Monday, you should be able to explain that as well. Okay, I don't think I need to go over again explaining things in detail like we had on Tuesday when we went over the trimester exam, but just an interesting question to think about as we finish up here with section 2. When it comes to section 3, and let me just move this up here a little bit so you guys can see. Section 3 is going to focus here, switching regions here. We said the title of this chapter, the North and South taking different paths. Certainly the South is taking the path of agriculture as far as making its money. The North focusing on industry and factories and manufacturing. The South sticking with what works for them and believing that it is going to be agriculture that is going to make the most sense as far as making money is concerned. Now, when you think about the South, we are going to begin to see a few differences here. In the last section, we talked about the word urban or urbanization. And when we talk about urban or urbanizations, always try to remember it's referring to cities. Okay, rural areas are isolated. Okay, and down south, because of the large plantations, many people lived in rural areas because their plantations took up hundreds of acres, if not maybe a few hundred acres, so that there wouldn't necessarily be a lot of other families around them. The North is going to drastically affect the South, okay? And this is something that is going to need to be embedded into your heads over the course of the next, really until the end of the year, because the North is going to have a high demand for products. And because they have a high demand, especially when we're talking about factories that are making textiles, making clothing, what do you make clothing out of? Well, not wood, not fish, not tobacco. It's made out of cotton. All right? It's made out of cotton. So, in order to keep up with the demand in the North, the South is going to have to keep up with that demand. Okay, so while factories are being built in the North, they are going to need the cotton and the South, cotton from the South rather. Okay, and during the 19th century, the southern part of the United States becomes known as the Cotton Kingdom. Okay, so when we're talking about the Cotton Kingdom, we're referring to the southern part of the United States. Now, during the latter part of the 18th century and into the beginning of the 19th century, the South was still known for a number of different crops, okay? But with the United States and the northern part of the United States beginning to have factories, especially during the time of the War of 1812, um, the South becomes more inclined to grow cotton. Many of these plantations will switch over from tobacco now to cotton. Now, for those of you who have cotton balls in your house, many of you are associating thinking about cotton as something that is nice and soft and fluffy. However, if you were to pick a cotton plant by hand, growing from the ground, in order to get that fluffiness, you would have to be able to pick out these sharp, small seeds, okay, which was a very difficult thing to do. On average, at the beginning of the 19th century, um, one person would be able to pick about a pound of cotton a day. Okay, so that's not really that much when you think about it. Now, trying to keep up with the demand, if the southern plantations can't keep up with that demand, they're not going to be able to make as much money as they can. So, we see inventors thinking outside the box a little bit. And the inventor that is going to change the way cotton is picked is a man by the name of Eli Whitney. Now, Eli Whitney is going to invent what becomes known as the cotton gin. Okay, and here's a picture of the cotton gin right here. And it's a machine that essentially, instead of having a human hand pick the seeds out of the cotton, you're basically going to pull this crank, all right, wheel it around, okay, you're feeding the cotton through, and inside of the box here, as the cotton is pulled down into this general area here, okay, that's all the fluffy cotton. All the seeds would be caught, there would be like a trap door there. So it would be able, this machine, this mechanism would be able to pick the seeds out of cotton a lot easier. Now, with the invention of the cotton gin, it is estimated that approximately one person would be able to pick 50 pounds of cotton a day in comparison to 1 pound of cotton by hand a day. So this is going to completely revolutionize the way cotton is grown and picked, and as a result, it's going to make many plantation owners a lot of money. Cotton in the United States during the 19th century becomes the greatest source of wealth for the United States. Um, Not only are we talking about it as the greatest crop that is sold and distributed throughout the United States, but it's also distributed throughout Europe. Um, One of the things that I had made mention of back in the second trimester, the Panic of 1837. It's a time period in the United States where we begin to go into an economic downfall. Why is that? Well, Britain stops purchasing cotton here from the United States. So that's just yet another example as to how important cotton was during this time period. Many historians refer to the cotton that is grown during this time as white gold, okay, because cotton became such a valuable commodity to the United States, as you can imagine. So it's kind of ironic in some fashion that the North relied heavily on the South for cotton, and the South relied heavily on the North to purchase the cotton. So the two of them worked really hand in hand with each other. This is something that your textbook, this last bullet point here, something that your textbook doesn't necessarily talk about, was that prior to the discovery and the invention of the cotton gin, here in the United States, slavery had really began to take a slight downfall as far as the number of enslaved African Americans. It is believed that in 1790, okay, there was approximately 700,000 slaves here in the United States. However, with the invention of the cotton gin and it being that much more easier to pick and produce cotton, many southern plantation owners are going to wind up going to hiring more slaves to keep up with that demand. The idea was that the more cotton they grew, the more money they could make themselves. By the time of the Civil War, it is estimated that the number of slaves had increased to approximately 4 million, which is certainly a very sad thing when you think about it, that an invention that was supposed to make things easier actually winds up increasing the number of slaves here in the United States. If any of you have your textbooks handy, and I'll certainly make mention of this on Monday, there's a great chart in your textbook on the second page there of section 3 that looks at how the demand of cotton grew, okay, and the number of slaves grew with it, okay? So the production of cotton and the number of slaves really went hand in hand with each other when talking about this so-called Cotton Kingdom. Now, in the South, obviously, slavery became a way of life, okay? Southern whites were very accepting, okay, of what was expected of African Americans. Even if you were a free African American, approximately 6% of the southern population was free African Americans. They were very limited in what they could do and accomplish. They weren't able to vote like northern free African Americans were, and many of them had extreme difficulties in finding jobs. Now, when it came to the North and the South on their views of slavery, the North felt as though that the use of slaves um, was unfair. They felt as though that it was inhumane. As I mentioned earlier, many northern states had already taken steps to try and ban slavery, so the fact that many southerners had plantations and had slaves bothered the North. Well, the southerners defended slavery, and they said, well, listen, you guys have all those factories up there, you have all these immigrants coming in, unemployment is becoming a big problem for northern cities. We here in the South, we don't have that problem. Slaves aren't necessarily find it hard to find jobs. Now, that rationalization is real. Okay, Southern plantation owners argued that slaves had jobs. Well, the last time I checked, jobs you got paid. So, um, as I, Southerners accepted slavery as a way of life. Northerners, in their defense of that, would say, well, wait a second. If someone doesn't like their job, they can quit. So you're telling us that slaves, if they don't like being a slave, could quit? And obviously, slave owners wouldn't have much to argue in that defense. So when push comes to shove, this is yet another example of how the South and the North have two completely different and polarizing views on slavery. And it's certainly an unfortunate circumstance as we move forward. The end of section 3, I don't want to spend too much time on it with the notes, because we really talked about it and it's somewhat repetitive, is that life, obviously, with slavery, under slavery, was very tough. Okay, people weren't necessarily considered to be uh, a person in the eyes of a slaveholder. They were rather a thing. And remember back in the first trimester, me kicking over the podium, that's my property. Okay, me kicking over the stool, that's my property. I can do with whatever I want to do with my property. A stool or a podium, it doesn't have feelings. And that was the mindset of Southerners. It was a way of life. Okay, we already talked about, and Section 3 does talk about slave codes again. It was meant to control every aspect of a slave's life, and they would be forced to do here hard manual labor. But keep in mind, I had made reference to this back in the first trimester. Although slaves' lives were very tough, most slave owners realized that there was one key protection, and that was that these slaves were valuable pieces of property. So, really, what saved their lives, their one protection, was that they were valuable. And slave owners needed these slaves to be productive in order to make money, so it would benefit them to make sure that they were fed. They were not starved. They were not beaten to a point where they wouldn't be able to do work the next day. Now, are there certain circumstances which slaves would be beat very severely? Certainly, that was the case because it was their property. Remember, under slave codes, a slave owner could kill their own slave and without having to go to jail for murder. So, certainly the issues of slavery here, if we were to say that there was any protection, it would be that they were valuable pieces of property. Throughout the 19th century, though, something that's becoming more and more common are slave revolts. Okay, and probably the most famous slave revolt, as well as slave, turned, um, who was a little bit of a controversial guy, and I'll talk about him on Monday, is a man by the name of Nat Turner, who was a runaway slave in 1831 who winds up gathering other, helping to have other slaves escape, but that wasn't enough for him. Okay, he wanted to make a statement here, and what was known as Nat Turner's slave revolt or Turner's slave revolt. He winds up killing 60 white males, both men and young boys, who would have been of age to help out and work on plantations. And this is going to be a very controversial slave revolt in the South. Thus, because of this, many plantation owners will look to increase the amount of slave codes on their individual plantations here. So, all in all, unfortunately, the institution of slavery is going to remain here in the 19th century because of the demand for cotton. Um, and with these two polarizing different views, we're beginning to plant the seeds here in chapter 11 about the differences between the North and the South when it came to the issues of slavery. And obviously, at the end of the trimester, we'll talk more about the build up to what will become known as the Civil War. Okay, so this is the last slide of notes. Hopefully, you enjoyed this. This was actually pretty fun for me to do. I hope you guys behave for your substitute. And when I come back on Monday, what we'll do is we'll go over these notes, make sure that they're in your notebook. Okay, if you guys have any questions on the slides, we can go over them. And then remember, we'll be going on to chapter 12, where we'll talk about what some people, abolitionists, people who are against slavery, are doing. And then we'll also get into the women's rights movement. So, hope you guys enjoyed this. And like I said, I look forward to seeing you guys on Monday. I swear I probably didn't have a good time in Disney. I'm just kidding. I'm sorry. Take care.